Hi everyone, in this presentation I'm going to introduce a workflow for independent timeline transcription in low resource documentation contexts. Okay, I realise I won't be able to go into a lot of detail about all the different steps or procedures in this process, but I want to give you an overview of the workflow and a sense of whether it would be useful or not in whatever context you're working in. So if you do think it would be useful, please feel free to get in touch if you'd like a bit more detail. So I'm going to start with an introduction, then go through the workflow and show two projects where I've implemented this workflow before concluding. Okay, so the sort of background to my interest in transcription here is that I think it's often seen as the bottleneck in the documentation process, in that it can be very time consuming and expensive, while also really essential to later stages of analysis. And I think that's why there's increasingly a move to try and delegate transcription to automatized tools. But it's important to note that even when these increase efficiency, they're not necessarily preferred by community members themselves. And I think that's because transcription is in itself a really valuable linguistic activity. It's an important stage of the analysis. Himmelmann 2018 describes it as a reflective mode of language use, in that it's a kind of window into metalinguistic knowledge. And it can also be a really valuable cooperative social activity and an important language and or literacy learning activity in different contexts. Okay, the workflow I'm going to talk about is not going to be relevant in every documentation context. There are some contexts where you might not have sufficient technology access to do this whole process, and there are others where you have enough access to technology to access more efficient workflows than this one. But basically, if what you have is access to mobile phones or MP3 players and sufficient writing materials, and what you don't have is widespread use of computers and confidence using and running computers, then I think this might be really useful for you. And I've found that it's especially useful if you're moving between communities and you want to make sure that that time that you're not within each particular community is still being used for transcription. And where there is some community literacy, I think that just makes it all a bit easier, even if that literacy is not in the language that is the focus of the transcription. Okay, the three open source software tools that this workflow relies on are Seymour, Elan, and Audacity. And in the projects I've used, it's been myself or linguistic student research assistants who have been using those particular softwares. But there will be other software tools that you need to use, especially apps, and particularly if you want to make this work remotely. And those are messaging apps, audio player apps, camera apps, and file transfer services. And in those, you sort of have a little bit less control over what's available to people. But I will point out some of the features that you want to be looking for to make sure that this will work. Okay, so here is a brief overview of the workflow as a whole. I've split it into three main areas: preparing files for transcription, independent transcription, and typing up. And then there are subsections within each of those stages. And I think it's really important throughout to bear in mind that if you're doing independent transcription, then how you support your transcribers to get the most out of the transcription experience is also really important. Okay, so the first and probably most fiddly stage is preparing your files for transcription. So we're going to start with your audio recording of a whole event and end up with labeled MP3 audio files per short section of text that can be played on repeat by your transcribers. The first step is to use the auto segmentation feature in Seymour to produce a simple LM file that has two tiers, one for transcription and one for translation, chunked into handy segments for transcription. You could do this in Elan, but it involves more clicks. The next step is to open that .eaf annotation file in Elan and use the label and number annotation function for a tier to produce codes, which you'll have a code for the overall recording event and then individual segment numbers as well. And then heading back to open that annotation file in Seymour again, you can now export that tier with your codes and labels as an Audacity label file. And then moving into Audacity, we can import the original audio recording, usually a .wav file, and your .text Audacity label file, and export using the multiple files option to get labeled MP3 audio files for each segment. Okay, and then the different stages of the actual independent transcription itself can be thought of as getting the files to your transcribers being able to listen to those files, to produce handwritten transcripts and translations if that is something that you're also looking for, and then you getting those transcripts back either physically or digitally. And it's at this stage that really supporting your transcribers becomes really, really important, and thinking about all the things you've done to make sure that all those benefits of transcription that we've talked about are realized for your transcribers. So that can involve training, regular check-ins, keeping discussions open about orthography, and making sure that there's space for reflections and corrections. Okay, in terms of getting the files to your transcribers, there are two main ways I've done this, either preloaded on kind of micro SD cards to insert into people's phones, or preloaded onto MP3 players. And then increasingly in my current project, it's involved sharing the files via a messaging app or file transfer service. It's important at this stage to check that your transcribers can definitely access them, and in order to facilitate that, you want to make sure that you keep the file structure simple. And some things to look out for messaging apps and file transfer services are things like, does the messaging app send those files while maintaining the file names? Unfortunately, Facebook Messenger has recently lost that ability, which is a shame. And does the file transfer service require an email address? So within the Vanuatu context, a lot of people have Facebook, but not email addresses, and that can be an obstacle to using certain file transfer services. Okay, and then for the actual listening, this could be done on an MP3 player or on a mobile phone with an audio playback app. Things to check are whether the codes are displaying correctly. I found this was a problem with my initial codes when I was using MP3 players, that they could only display, I think it was only sort of 5 letters or numbers anyway were actually displayed on the screen. So it was important to make sure that that was displaying properly. The audio playback app also needs to have some features which increasingly I'm finding the default apps on newer Android phones don't actually offer, which is really frustrating. But you need to be able to play a single track on repeat. You need to be able to sort by file name, and you need to display that file name. So those are things to look out for when you're checking whether this is going to work properly. Okay, and then your transcribers will produce handwritten transcripts, which could include translations too in this case, which need to be labeled for the recording event with the code that you've used, as well as labeling each segment. And I'd really encourage transcribers to include notes, reflections, corrections, and just on a practical note, hours that people are working. I do use separate timesheets as well, but I find it really helpful to make sure people don't forget anything and really are keeping track of the hours if they write in their start and finish times while they're doing the transcription. You can see some examples here that have been shared remotely using a camera app and messaging app. So you can see the quality isn't always amazing, but it is pretty legible. And of course, you can just do this physically if you are there in person. And you can see a little example of a note here where somebody's given a bit more explanation of that longos word where the Bislama translation doesn't quite get at the full meaning of that. So that kind of thing can be really, really helpful to encourage people to include. Okay, and then the next stage is to type up what's in those handwritten transcripts into the annotation file that was originally generated in Seymour. You could do that in Seymour or in Elan, and then the end result is that you have your timeline transcription to refer back to, and that should be really straightforward as long as the labeling is clear throughout. This is also a really useful stage to be checking for things like omissions or overcorrections, over translations. If people have used, for example, sometimes when people use Bislama in VAT longos, sometimes transcribers are inclined to provide the VAT longos which is great as long as it's clearly marked as not what's in the recording. And then you're all set up for further analysis, processing, distribution, archiving, etc. And I've got a few little screenshots here to show you some of that process. So on the left there, you can see inputting it into Eleanor, processing it further for interlinear glossing in Flex, and then making that available via Pangloss in the archival deposit in the bottom there. Okay, so I first developed this workflow as part of my PhD project, which involved fieldwork between 2014 and 2018. And we used this workflow with 3 transcribers, Madeline, Simeon, and Belle. Madeline and Simeon already had a bit of experience as part of a Bible translation project, which they were bringing to it. Belle didn't have that kind of experience, but was quick to learn. And this worked particularly well because I was moving between urban and rural communities about every 2 to 5 weeks during the 2 6-month fieldwork trips. And this meant that a lot of progress could be made on the transcription in between trips, but there were also lots of really regular check-ins and opportunities for me to see what was going on as well. We started out using MP3 players, and as phones became more common in Vanuatu and also cheaper, we started using those more, or phones that had the capacity to play MP3s. And during the time frame of the project, we managed to transcribe and translate into Bislama 215 out of the 378 recording events as part of the project. And the kind of outputs for that are my thesis and an archival deposit with Pangloss, which you just saw a screenshot from. Okay, and the current project that I'm working on is a 3-year Marsden Fast Start project funded by the Royal Society Te Aparangi in New Zealand. And I've been a bit more ambitious this time about the number of transcribers. So there's potential for up to 80 young people to take part. We've done one of the 2 major field trips so far, so 40 people have taken part in the training, who can then decide whether or not to continue to work as transcribers. And the transcription of both Fatlongth and Bislama in this case involves archival recordings recorded by the anthropologist Bob Tonkinson between the 1960s and 2000s. That's in Paradisec. As well as the participants' own monologues in 4 different genres and recordings of group discussions in language support workshops. So lots to transcribe. What we found is that for the urban participants in particular, where language loss is more advanced, this is often quite a challenging but interesting language learning activity. Whereas for rural participants, they've really focused on it as a kind of writing practice more so. And have found it really interesting, especially with the archival recordings, to get exposed to sort of different speech styles and registers. This involves 3 fieldwork trips of 6 weeks. We've only done one of them so far. So this involves more remote implementation of this workflow and a lot of kind of international communication. So it's mostly worked pretty well, but the logistics of communication, file sharing, payment, those types of logistical infrastructure challenges are obviously more of an issue with this type of implementation of the workflow. Okay, so to conclude, I just want to emphasize that transcription is a really valuable activity in itself, and even though it can be time consuming and expensive, as far as possible, we should try and not completely offload that to technical tools. And this workflow is one that facilitates efficient, independent transcription while maintaining time alignment throughout, which is really great for ensuring the robustness of all your analyses down the line. It's especially useful for situations where there's access to MP3 players on mobile phones, but restricted use of computers. And the workflow can be adapted to work with more transcribers and both remote and online projects, but both of those require more attention to training, support, and the kind of broader logistics. Okay, I would really like to thank all the transcribers who've taken part in both projects. Here are some pictures of the young transcribers in the current project, as well as the community administrators who have really helped with those logistics that I've been talking about, our student research assistants at Massey, and the funders of the 2 projects, which was the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council for the PhD and the Marsden Fund for the current project. Here are some references. Super, thank you to Mas.